The silent passenger. It was a cold December evening, and Laura had just finished her late shift at the diner. The roads were empty, and the thick fog wrapped around her small car like a ghostly shroud. She turned on the radio to break the eerie silence, but all she got was static. Shrugging, she focused on the road ahead, the beams of her headlights cutting through the darkness. About halfway home, Laura noticed something strange in her rearview mirror. A shadowy figure seemed to be sitting in the backseat. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't picked up anyone. Telling herself it was just her imagination, she adjusted the mirror for a better look. The backseat was empty. She let out a shaky laugh, blaming her tired mind. But as she drove on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. At a red light, Laura glanced in the mirror again. This time, the figure was unmistakable. A man, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He was staring directly at her. Panic surged through her. She gripped the wheel tightly, trying to think. Should she stop? Call the police? Her phone was in her bag, out of reach. The light turned green, and Laura sped off, her heart pounding. She could hear faint breathing behind her, steady and slow. Suddenly, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped at the diner tonight." Laura screamed, swerving the car. She pulled over to the side of the road, flung open the door, and scrambled out. A truck driver passing by saw her distress and stopped. "What's wrong, miss?" he asked, his concerned eyes scanning her pale face. "There's someone in my car," she cried. The truck driver grabbed a flashlight and approached her vehicle cautiously. He opened the back door and shone the light inside. The back seat was empty. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked, his brows furrowed. Laura nodded, trembling. "I heard him. I felt him." The truck driver scratched his head. "Maybe you're just overtired. Let me follow you home to make sure you're safe." Reluctantly, Laura agreed. She got back into her car, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. The truck followed close behind, its headlights a comforting presence. When she finally reached her driveway, she breathed a sigh of relief. She turned to thank the truck driver, but the truck was gone. Confused, she stepped out of her car and looked around. That's when she noticed something chilling. Written in the condensation on her rear window were the words, "Next time, you won't see me coming." Terrified, Laura bolted inside her house, locking every door and window. She called the police, who arrived within minutes. They inspected her car and the surrounding area but found no sign of anyone. "Maybe it's a prank," one of the officers suggested, though his tone wasn't convincing. Laura didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of her house made her jump. She sat in her living room, clutching a kitchen knife, her eyes darting to every shadow. The next morning, she decided to take her car to a mechanic, just in case. As the mechanic inspected it, he froze, his face pale. "Miss," he said slowly, "did you know there's a compartment under your backseat?" Laura's blood ran cold. "No. Why?" The mechanic pulled out a small, blood-stained knife and a crumpled photograph of Laura, taken that very night at the diner. Her knees buckled as the mechanic called the police again. The officers returned, more serious this time. They combed through the car, the compartment, and the area around her home. But the man in the shadows was never found. Weeks passed, and Laura tried to move on, though she refused to drive alone at night. But one evening, as she walked to her car in the diner parking lot, she noticed something. On her windshield, tucked under the wiper blade, was a single Polaroid. It was a picture of her, sitting in her car, staring into the rearview mirror. The caption read, "Still watching." Laura left town the next day and never looked back. But no matter where she went, she always felt the weight of unseen eyes following her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Laura left town, desperate to escape the terror that had gripped her life. She moved to a quiet, distant place, a small mountain village where everyone knew each other. For a while, she felt safe. The air was crisp, the nights were silent, and the villagers were kind. She took a job at a local cafe, where the days passed peacefully. The memory of the shadowy figure in her car began to fade, though it never disappeared completely. She avoided mirrors and rarely drove at night, just in case. Months went by, and Laura started to believe she had outrun the nightmare. That is, until one evening when she stayed late to close the cafe. The streets were empty as she walked to her car. Snow had begun to fall, and the quiet crunch of her boots on the ground was the only sound. She reached her car, brushed the snow off the windshield, and froze. There, written in the frost on the driver's side window, were the words, "Found you." Her breath hitched. She spun around, scanning the empty street, but no one was there. Heart pounding, she climbed into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. She told herself it was just a coincidence, a cruel prank by some local kids. As she drove through the winding mountain roads, the snow fell harder, making it difficult to see. The headlights barely cut through the blizzard. The uneasy feeling she'd tried to bury for months began to creep back. And then it happened. Her radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. Static filled the car, loud and jarring. Laura reached to turn it off, but before she could, a familiar voice broke through the static. "You can't run forever, Laura." She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. Her breathing was ragged, her hands trembling. She looked into the rearview mirror. The shadowy figure was there, sitting calmly in the backseat. This time, his face was partially visible. A cruel smile stretched across pale, lifeless features. "No," she screamed, flinging the door open and stumbling out into the snow. She ran blindly into the storm, the cold biting at her skin. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The sound of footsteps crunched behind her, deliberate and unhurried. "Laura," the voice called, "closer now. You can't hide." She tripped, falling face first into the snow. Scrambling to her feet, she turned to see the figure standing a few feet away, his dark silhouette barely visible in the storm. Desperate, she grabbed a large branch from the ground and swung it at him. But as it connected, he vanished, dissolving into the wind like smoke. Terrified, Laura ran until she reached the edge of the village. Lights from a nearby cabin flickered in the distance. She pounded on the door, sobbing and screaming for help. An elderly man opened the door, his face lined with concern. He let her in, and she collapsed onto the floor, shivering and gasping for air. As she tried to explain what had happened, the man's expression changed. He grew quiet, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the first," he said gravely. Laura stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then walked to a shelf and pulled down an old, dusty book. Flipping through its pages, he stopped at a faded photograph. It was a picture of a man, the same man who had been in her car. This man was a drifter, the old man explained. He preyed on women traveling alone, followed them, tormented them. He was caught years ago and killed in a car crash on this very mountain road. Laura's blood ran cold. "But he's dead." The old man nodded. "Some say his spirit still lingers, seeking revenge on those who remind him of his victims. Once he finds you, he never lets go." Laura sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew now that no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the shadowy figure would always follow. And as the wind howled outside, carrying with it a faint, chilling whisper, she realized the truth. Her nightmare was only beginning. Subscribe for more interesting story.